If you're curious, I do have a few more of these up here, kind of giving you a picture, kind of a snapshot of the spread of the church, the early church. And that is really going to come into play as we look at the outline that we have this morning. This is part one of a two-part lesson. We're looking at the years between 100 and 325, sometimes referred to as the ante-Nicene age of the church, A-N-T-E, not A-N-T-I, but A-N-T-E, meaning before Nicaea. Nicaea is typically referred to as, if not the first, then the first ecumenical council. There were other councils before Nicaea, but Nicaea is kind of identified as the first, what is referred to as the ecumenical council, where all the church got together. So 325 AD is kind of one of those marker years, marker dates in church history. Last year, oh, it's been a long week. Last week, we were kind of looking at that first century, the close of the first century, and what was transpiring, say, between the close of the New Testament, which we really don't know when the New Testament, the final book was written in the New Testament, but around about, say, somewhere between 80 and 100 was probably, well, no, I would say no later than 80 AD. And then 100 is kind of that, all right, the first century is over, we're moving into the second century. I want to point out as we look at this series of thoughts this morning that we want to be very aware of a sin that C.S. Lewis identified as chronological snobbery. Anybody have any idea what the phrase chronological snobbery might refer to? Beautiful C.S. Lewis phrase.
It almost sounds like what we deal with now. My generation is better than your generation because we had to work harder for what we have than what you do.
Yes, in a way. My generation is better than your generation because you're just so dumb, or your generation was just so dumb. Although maybe larger than just generation, but we in the 25th century, I'm going to have a long day today. In the 21st century, we're just so much smarter. We would not have made the mistakes that you guys made in the 1st, 2nd, 3rd, 5th, 12th, 15th centuries because we're just so much wiser. We're just so much smarter. And C.S. Lewis, in his inimical way, pointed out that if we had been alive during that time period, very likely we would have made the same mistakes, if not more. That we can see things more clearly looking back because of our history, because we have their mistakes to learn from, and also their wisdom to learn from. So if we look at the close of last week's lesson, roundabout AD 100 and 325 being the Council of Nicaea, we're looking at 225 years. Wanted to point out that our nation now is 249 years old. So the time period between AD 100, what we call the end of that first century, and 325 is roughly, although not perfectly, the same amount of time between 1776 and today. So we can look back on our history as a nation and kind of compare that to what somebody in 325 would be looking back at the close of that first 100 years, right at the end of the first century. And so we think, well, how could things have changed so radically? How could things have been so different in 325 than they were in 100? Well, how different is our world today? And I'm not talking about computers and cars and airplanes, and I'm not talking about scientific discoveries. I'm talking about our way of thinking. How different is it today than good old George Washington, and I don't know who else was alive back then. So we think, wow, they really changed. We wouldn't have changed like that. Well, yeah, we did. We have our think about how we respond even to our. Thank you, Darren. How we respond to our Constitution today, as opposed to how they would have viewed in 325, how they might have viewed some of the writings of not only the apostles, but in that early second century, and all of the many writings. We talked about a few of them last week: Clement, Papias, the writings of Polycarp. So they would have, in 325, they would have viewed those writings in a much different way than they would have been viewed as they were actually written. So as we make this transition from 100 to 200 to 300, 325 AD, we need to look at the spread of Christianity in three different dimensions. I want to think about it in terms of time, which we were just talking about, distance, and languages. And each of these dimensions is going to have an impact on how the church responded to various concerns, various questions. Let's think of time. How does the passage of time affect our perceptions? And just think of our country, 2025 as opposed to 1776. As that founding generation were writing not only the Constitution, but the other many other papers and articles associated with the Constitution, as opposed to how we look at it today. Do you think they viewed the Constitution a little bit different than we do? You think they responded to it? I was reading an article earlier this week. Apparently, when the founding fathers established the House of Representatives, the Senate, the presidency, I don't know about the president, but the Congress, the Senate, and the House of Representatives were only supposed to receive a daily stipend. They were not supposed to receive a salary. Because the founding fathers' point was, if they're getting rich by going to Philadelphia or Washington or where the capital was, and everybody else has to stay home and work, these people are going to start thinking about themselves how?
As elitist.
Guess what? happened when we started paying them. Especially, get this, if they get to vote for their own pay raises. Stan, do you get to vote for your own? Oh, I think I'll just give myself a 25% pay raise this year. All in favor? Oh, it's a unanimous agreement. Yay. So, yeah, how we view the role of our Senate and the role of our House of Representatives, and even the role of the president. We went from having three equal roles of government: presidency, the executive, the legislative, and the judicial. Now it's just kind of a free-for-all. Judges are telling the president what to do. The Senate's not doing much of anything. House of Representatives is throwing hand grenades at each other, so they're not really doing a whole lot either. And so the passage of time. Just think of the passage of time between the close of World War II and today. Who were the, I guess you could call them, leading figures in the United States in 1945? Who was president?
Roosevelt, but then,
He had just died.
okay.
So it was Truman. So even that part of our history is getting faded, isn't it? Unless you really love history. Who succeeded Truman? And I might even be wrong about this one. Anybody remember?
Eisenhower.
I think it was Eisenhower. I know that Eisenhower was elected, so whether he immediately followed Truman. Kylie, you should know this. My daughter, the scholar, yay! So the passage of time puts all that stuff, unless we're just constantly immersed in it, we start forgetting it. It becomes all jumbled. All the facts get all tangled up. And so, and we have the ability to call this up on our cell phones, on our tablets. Imagine basically a pre-literate culture, how the passage of time is going to affect our view of history and that sort of thing. Customs change, even the way we dress changes over time. Yeah.
If you think about it, we're at that point where we're so reliant on technology, we can probably name the first 2 or 3 presidents, and we can name the last 2 or 3 presidents, and we can name the 16th president.
Really?
Abraham Lincoln.
Oh, okay.
But other than that, the gaps in between are just that. They're gaps.
Yeah. I was thinking of how clothing changes through the passage of time. We don't dress even the same way over 100 years, 200 years. You know, you go back and you see pictures of, once again, our founding fathers, and a lot of them had the little knicker kind of breeches. They were referred to, the breeches. Well, all that's changed. Ladies would never be caught wearing pants.
Or pajamas.
Yeah. especially out in public, well, you might, but my grandmother, I don't even know that my grandmother and my aunts even owned a pair of what we would consider to be pants. My mom would, but she wouldn't be caught dead uh, going to a worship service in anything other than a dress or a skirt. So our clothing choices change throughout time. Distance, geographic references. The New Testament is absolutely full of geographic references. Jesus went down to Jerusalem. Jesus went up to. Jesus went here. Jesus went there. And when you're separated, hundreds, if not thousands, of miles away from this geography, it doesn't make any sense. So the geographic references, people become more vague. If you have never really been around the Pharaoh of Egypt, who's the Pharaoh of Egypt? Doesn't matter. All of the references to the Herods don't make any sense. If you've been born and raised 1,000 miles away from Palestine, who's a Herod? What's a Herod? What's a Pharaoh? And so as the distance increases, all of these geographic references become vague and obscure. And then that third one, our languages. As we look at this map, and maybe I should have put this on the overhead. If we look at kind of the right-hand half of this map, say everything from Achaia, Macedonia to the east, they're all Greek speakers, or mostly Greek speakers. All right? If we move across the Sea of Adria, do you need a map? Weren't you here last week? Oh, sorry. Never criticize your wife. If we're over here on the left-hand side of the map, the Sea of Adria, the Adriatic Sea, they're all going to be primarily Latin speakers. And if we move further to the left and we cross the Mediterranean Sea, then we get into Spain. Now we're talking about a third language. It's going to be primarily based on Latin. The Spanish language, Italian, is based on Latin. We call them the Romance languages, the Latin based. Then, if we move due south and we get into Africa and Egypt, we're talking about yet another language. And every place that the gospel went, every place that the church, every new land that the church was introduced to with its own languages, they would take the writings of the New Testament and translate them into those languages. So we don't have just Hebrew into Greek, which would be the Old Testament into the Greek language. We have the Hebrew into Latin. We have the Hebrew into Coptic. We have the Hebrew into a number of other. And this map doesn't even talk about the spread of the gospel going east. This is just the spread of the gospel going west. So we have the Hebrew Old Testament into all these different languages. We've got the Greek New Testament being translated into Latin. And further west, we've got the Greek New Testament being translated into Coptic and other languages headed south, going east. So, but translation is never perfect. It's problematic, especially when you go from Greek into Latin. There's all kinds of interesting issues with Latin. There is no direct, definite article in Latin. You don't say the man, you just say man. And the context tells you whether you're talking about the man or a man. So now, that's a problem, but it's also kind of a gift because we can compare the Greek to the Latin to the Coptic to all these other different languages. And if there is a problem with the manuscript, only the very, 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 very few passages, for instance, in the New Testament, are there more questions than answers. We can almost always, with a high degree of certainty, come up with what the original writer, what the original author had to say. Okay, so Christianity is spreading all over the world. It's getting further and further and further away from the time of Jesus. Just think about this. In AD 100, it would probably be possible for you to go find someone who actually conversed with Jesus. You could find, well, maybe one or two of the apostles. But for instance, Mark, we consider Mark to be a very young man in the life of Jesus. He might have still been alive around AD 90, maybe 100, I don't know. But you could have talked to an eyewitness of Jesus. You certainly could have talked to an eyewitness of Paul, an eyewitness of John. Polycarp, they said, was an eyewitness of John. Papias was considered to be an eyewitness of the later apostles. So in AD 100, you could talk to someone who had that kind of direct knowledge. By 325, you're not going to find anybody that old. All right? So as time goes by, as distances increase, the more languages. So we've got all these kind of things going on. Secondly, the second major thing that occurs during 100 and 325 is how the Jews and how the Romans particularly started responding to Christianity. Early on, the Jews basically considered Christianity to be a demented sect of Judaism. You guys have just got the Messiah wrong, right? Quit talking about the Messiah and you can still be a good Jew. Quit talking about this Jesus of Nazareth being the Messiah. You can still be a faithful Jew, all right? As time went on, and as Christianity grew, particularly within the synagogues, that was the major seedbed for Christianity, was the synagogue. Now the Jews are beginning to figure out, hey, we've got to do something about this group, right? And it really is kind of fascinating looking back at how the Jews responded. For instance, one of the early translations from the Hebrew Old Testament into Greek, so that the Jewish Greek reading people could have it, we refer to it as the Septuagint. Well, because so many Christians were using the Septuagint to prove that Jesus was the Christ, to prove that Jesus was the Messiah, they came up with another translation. And they would do this. If the Christians would look at passages in Isaiah and say, see how Jesus fulfilled this prophecy? And so the Jews quit using Isaiah because it became a proof text for Christianity. And so, in a lot of respects, just the faith of Christianity itself had a transforming effect on the Jews because of the way the Jews were responding to Christianity. So it started out as being just an irritation. You're just a weird sect of our nation. And then it became a mortal enemy of Judaism, which then played into how the Romans referred to it. By and large, the Romans looked at religion as you choose, you do you, and we'll do us. So long as you never openly defied the Roman gods. You know, you can have your Jewish God, but you still have to worship our Roman gods. You can have your pagan God over here, but you have to include our Roman gods. And so when the Christians came along, and this is how, interestingly enough, the Jews kind of sort of got along with the Romans. You remember what the scribes and Pharisees, not scribes and Pharisees, what the Sadducees and the chief priests and all said to Pilate in the Gospel of John when they had Jesus before Pilate? What did they say to Pilate to finally get Pilate to convict Jesus and to have him crucified?
We have no king but Caesar.
We have no king but Caesar. The ultimate blasphemy. Right? But that's how they kind of made peace with the Romans. We'll acknowledge Caesar as king if you'll let us have our synagogues. And by the way, we'll pay a lot of taxes and make you very, very rich and all this kind of stuff. Okay, so the Romans kind of just assumed that the Christians were they just went along with the Jews. You're just kind of a weird sect of Judaism until the Christians did what? Is a Christian going to bow the knee to Caesar? No. They're not going to offer, when you go into the marketplace, they're not going to put a little incense on the fire to worship the Roman gods. We have no God but Christ. We have no God but God. And so this is where the Romans said, we can't put up with you. And so the Romans actually persecuted the Christians. When they did persecute the Christians, they persecuted the Christians as atheists. You're an atheist. Why?
Because you don't believe in our God.
Yeah, you don't believe in my God. That makes you an atheist, right? Isn't that one of the weirdest ironies? Is that a Christian would be persecuted as an atheist? And there were very, very, very localized, very brutal persecutions of Christians. There were empire-wide persecutions of Christians, but they were very brief and not necessarily as severe as sometimes we try to make them out. Obviously, Polycarp was martyred. Ignatius was martyred. There are many stories of other individuals who were martyred, burned at the stake, fed to wild animals. There's all kinds of very, very gruesome stories of what happened to Christians. But sometimes we make it out to be that every Christian everywhere was always persecuted, and that's not true. There were emperors who were if not friendly to Christians, basically said, you don't cause any problems for us, and we won't cause any problems for you. There were very, very wicked emperors. Domitian, we think, may have been the emperor. If John wrote the book of Revelation somewhere around 80, 90, somewhere along in there, Domitian would have been the emperor. Caesar, not Caesar, Claudius kicked all of the Jews out of Rome. We read about this in the letter to the Corinthians. Who was it? The man and his wife, Paul's working companions. Priscilla and Aquila had to leave Rome when Claudius kicked all of the Jews. So even before the end of the New Testament, around about AD 50, 55, somewhere along in there, there were Roman persecutions of Jews / Christians. It would come in waves. An emperor would be somewhat friendly to Christianity, and then the next one would be vicious. And then the next one would say, I'm gonna back up, and I'm gonna let these people exist. If they don't cause any problems for us, we won't cause any problems for them. So it was an up and down, depending on where you were, depending on who the emperor was, and also what the Jews had to say. Because if the Jews caused a lot of problems for the Christians, then the Romans would step in, and it was kind of like the old saying, the enemy of my enemy is my friend. So the Jews and the Jews would get everything all riled up, and they would call the Romans in so that the Romans would then put the muscle on the Christians. And so you kind of have to say, when you talk about persecution, you have to say when and where and who was the emperor. Finally, the last one that we're going to get to this morning is going to be the church's self-identification. We're going to save number 4 for next week. And we're going to talk more about the false teachings that kind of crept up, kind of bubbled up during these first couple or 300 years, and what set the stage then for the number of church councils. So I wasn't planning on getting to point number 4 this morning, so don't think that I ran out of time, although I'm running out of time. The third major thing that I wanted to talk about this morning, though, is in this period between 100 and 325, how the church's self-identification changed and grew and morphed. Probably the most obvious would be that of organization. In the New Testament, and it's fascinating, we just finished with 1 Peter. We read in 1 Peter chapter 5, verses 1 and 2, that the church was overseen, was guided by, was led by a group of individuals that went by three names or 3 titles. They were elders, which meant that they were older. They were the presbyteros, right? They were the shepherds, the poimen, and they were the overseers, the episkopos. So we have presbyteros, we have poimen, we have episkopos. And they apparently were all different ways of referring to the same group of people. Acts chapter 20, verses 17 and verse 28, Paul calls the shepherds, he calls the elders of Ephesus to meet him, and he says, I want you to shepherd, poimen, the church that God has made you overseers, episkopos. So we have these 3 names in a couple of places, but Christians were referred to as ministers and priests. And interestingly enough, we read about this in 1 Peter chapter 2. What did Peter how did Peter identify the folks that he was writing to? He said, "You are a chosen race, a royal priesthood, a holy nation, a people for his own possession." So we've got this group of elder, shepherd, bishops that oversee the church, but everybody else is a minister. Everybody else is a priest. We're all equal. Well, over time, over distance, as languages change, this slowly began to morph and to change. It wasn't overnight. I mean, just think of how our Senate and House of Representatives and President were viewed in 1776. Look at how they're viewed in 2025. They're not viewed the same way. So, over time, the bishop started becoming more important, more valued than the presbyter. Instead of being equal, the bishop started having a higher role than the presbyter. The presbyter became more important than a priest. And it's fascinating that the early church picked up the language of Judaism, separating a priest from the people. Now we have the bishop, and we have a presbyter, and we have the priest. And the priests were elevated as clergy, separated from the laity. Right? The laity is the people. The clergy are those who have been specially anointed, specially appointed. Now, so we've got the priest. Above the priest, we've got the presbyters. Above the presbyters, we've got the bishops. Now, this did not happen overnight. And it did not happen in every place. Some places would be much more highly triangular. Some places would be more, as the New Testament described it, bishop, presbyter, shepherd, over the entire church who constituted the priesthood. And so we will see that as we move forward, all these little seeds, all these little sprouts. After 325 and 400 and 500 and 600 and 700 and 800, these become entrenched. And so now, for instance, as an example, in the Roman Catholic Church, who's the head of the Roman Catholic Church? The Pope. Beneath the Pope is
Is it archbishop or bishop? Or cardinal?
Cardinal. You have the College of Cardinals. Below the cardinals, you have
Either bishop or archbishop.
Archbishop.
I can't remember which one's higher than the other.
the archbishop. Then you have the bishops. Then you have
Priest.
the priest. And then below the priest, you have deacons. Right? Now, in the Eastern Orthodox Church, anybody have any knowledge of how the Eastern Orthodox Church is?
I haven't studied it that closely.
I haven't either. I was hoping somebody would bail me. As I understand it, the head of the Eastern Orthodox Church is referred to as the patriarch. The patriarch of the Eastern Orthodox. But in the Eastern Orthodox Church, you don't really, the patriarch is considered kind of the chief among equals. Does that make any sense? he is the specific head of the Eastern Orthodox Church, but he doesn't have that. As I understand it, and I could be like 1,000% wrong, he does not have that power or authority that, for instance, the Pope does in the Roman Catholic Church. Now, we'll talk about this when we get there, but the Eastern Orthodox split off from the Roman Catholic Church in the year 1054. I've memorized 325 and I've memorized 1054, and those are the only two. And I had no idea when the Treaty of Westfalgar was signed or whatever. Okay, any questions or, as I mentioned last week, anytime you have a question that you would like to have addressed during this series, please let me know so that I can do a little. I am not a historian. I love it. I absolutely love it. But by no means would I consider myself even an amateur historian. So please let me know anything that came up this morning that you have a question over or a comment about or anything. As I mentioned last week, you could literally spend an entire semester, and in fact, more than that, just on these 200 years, between 100 and 325. There is so much going on that has a huge impact later on down the road. Next week, we are going to start looking at the questions, what we refer to as heresies, that had such a significant impact on future doctrinal discussions and debates within the church. Namely, who was Jesus? Was he all God and no man? Was he all man and no God? Was he 50-50? Right? That was a huge question. The role of the Holy Spirit. Where did the Holy Spirit come from? One of the huge dividing issues between Roman Catholic and Eastern Orthodox is, where did the Holy Spirit come from? The acceptance of a formal canon. How did we get this? In 325, you could not pull out a Bible. It was, by 325, it was getting pretty close to being accepted everywhere by everybody. But the acceptance of a formal canon is the approved writings of Scripture was a huge point of debate and discussion. And then finally, the introduction of creeds. What is a creed? We're going to talk about that next week. Okay, let's take a break as we get ready. And please pass along any questions that you might have so that I can address them later on in the series. Do you still have